Hello, everybody. It's me again on another exciting episode of HockeyStick. Today, my guest is coming all the way from South Carolina. He is the director of AI at State of South Carolina, Richard Heimann. We've got two big things that I want to cover. The first one is your upcoming book, and I'm gonna attempt to pronounce the Sutskever's list. Is that roughly how you do it? But before all of that, what does a director of AI at State of South Carolina actually do? It sounds pretty grand.
Yeah, perhaps in title it does sound grandiose. The day-to-day of it is probably less. So the state director of AI, it probably varies somewhat state by state, because I think every state here in the US they have different goals and different aspirations, and they also have different resources that they could allocate to the adoption of artificial intelligence. And so South Carolina is a smaller state here. It's probably the 40th largest state by population. It's only about 5 million people. And so we have a smaller team, which I like. It reminds me of a startup, I guess, to some degree. It's a little bootstrappy, like everybody is wearing multiple hats and just trying to get things done. I can't probably talk too much about the details. Much of that, I leave that in the hands of elected officials. I'm not an elected official. But, what that means, practically speaking, is there are about 80 state agencies in South Carolina, all of which are interested in adopting AI. Some have a better idea of what that will look like than others, but generally speaking, they present their use case to myself and my peers inside of what's called the Center of Excellence here in South Carolina. And that's where we've just centralized some resources, one from a technical perspective, like myself, director of AI, but we also have a governance lead, a privacy lead, a security lead. And we're looking at use cases, and in some cases, we're helping shape those use cases and give them a little more definition to enhance the success. In other cases, we're looking at it from a risk mitigation perspective. So we're making recommendations on guardrails and how they might mitigate risk. And so that's a lot of my work, is just evaluating use cases coming from state agencies. We also have some internal use cases that we are developing in-house with a small group of application developers. So those more align with strategic pursuits, I guess you would say. And broad strokes, I think that's what it looks like, at least in South Carolina.
Oh. But is it mainly advisory, as in you guys should do this and you should do it that way?
About 80% of use cases. And then we have, I don't know, it's all informal. It doesn't necessarily have a name, but you could maybe think about it as an accelerator. We're developing some specific use cases that align with state strategic goals.
Got it. Okay. It still sounds grandiose to me. Sounds pretty useful too.
It's fun because what attracts me to something like this is just the scale of it. You're still talking about, even though South Carolina is a small state at 5 million people, you're talking about potentially impacting the lives of 5 million people. There are 40 or 50,000 government workers in South Carolina and 80 plus agencies. And so just the scale of the operation is pretty interesting. And the possibility, I guess, of impacting adoption of AI at that kind of scale is just attractive to me.
All right. And when you're not doing all of that, all of the above, you're also a busy guy, right? You're writing a book and a baby. Life is exciting, isn't it? Tell me about the book. What brought you to even think of writing it in the first place?
I've written other books in the past, and so I always have kind of this itch. The why I write, I think, is just to wrap my arms around my own ideas, which are something like AI is just a complex topic. It's hard to crystallize it in sort of these one-line maxims. And so how I wrestle with all of the nuance on the topic is just by writing, by researching these topics and writing about them. Oftentimes that comes in just an X thread or a LinkedIn post or something to that effect. But occasionally it demands a longer format. And so that's when the book comes into consideration. As it relates to Sutskever's list specifically, I just wrote something on the topic on LinkedIn maybe a year ago. Yeah, it's January. It's probably 13 months ago. And it caught the attention of somebody at Manning, and they really liked the idea. And so they asked me whether it deserved, like I was saying, a longer format, a book format. And I think it does, obviously. In retrospect, that's a self-evident statement. But initially, they had their own ideas about how it would come together. And they were like, what do you think about an anthology? And so an anthology would just be, this list comprises 27 sort of artifacts, most of which are academic white papers. And so their idea was just to have 27 chapters, each of which is going to analyze the papers in isolation. And I didn't love the idea. I thought a lot of the papers were connected and built on each other. And plus, I just thought they were part of a larger like human story, which is Sutskever's story. And so I told them like, that wouldn't be my strategy. I would probably do it like this. And they're like, we like that idea too. Would you write this book? And so I think they baited me in some sense into selling myself on how I would do it. But yeah, we started working on the contract about this time last year, and it took a couple of months actually to crystallize, but I started writing around the same time. So about 13 months or about 12 months ago, I started writing the book in earnest, even before we had a contract finalized. And so I just submitted the last chapter right before Christmas. And so it is officially done. The remaining chapters are going to be posted in Manning's early access program, was called the MEEP, in a couple of weeks.
Perfect. Yeah, I think it was showing 6 out of 9 when I was looking earlier today.
Yeah. So the rest of it's going to be available in the next couple of weeks.
Okay, so this is probably the only correct answer to this question, I think. Like anybody who doesn't say that, oh yeah, I wanted to write it so that I understand it fully is probably not 100% honest. And yeah, Manning people don't take no for an answer, do they? You shall write the book, please. All right, for a lot of people, I guess a lot of people will know that name from Twitter when there was some tweets, like, what was it, 2023, where Sam Altman was fired and then unfired and things went down, and maybe vaguely know that Sutskever is one of the OGs at OpenAI. But who is that guy, high level, for anybody who doesn't have a solid foundation? Why should we listen to him, right?
Yeah, it's a good question. So he is responsible for the AlexNet moment in 2012, which was probably the start, I guess, of the modern deep learning era, where a computer vision model beats the competition on the ImageNet dataset. ImageNet is a large computer vision like benchmark dataset. There's also a contest where researchers compete for the best performance. And up to that point, the state of the art was not deep learning. It was basically these engineered features like SIFT and HOP, and then paired with something like a support vector machine. So it was all shallow learning. And what Ilya and Alex and Jeffrey Hinton did in 2012 was convolutional neural network, deep learning, trained on the ImageNet dataset, and they eviscerated the competition. They reduced the error rate by about 50%. And so that caught a lot of people's attention. And that's like what people generally think is like the start of the modern deep learning revolution. He's also responsible for architectures like word-to-vec, which are feature representations, sequence-to-sequence models, which is actually the architecture that transformers are built on. He is obviously responsible for scaling the transformer architecture that was released by Google in 2017 at OpenAI. He's responsible for GPT-1, 2, 3, and so on. So he's been at the center of it over the last 10 or 15 years. And more than just an academic researcher, I think he's got this mystique around him. People are just attracted to him, I think partly because he doesn't really say a lot. And when he does, it's like these high signal kind of messages that it might post to X or what have you. And of course, he's responsible for things like the Sam Altman firing at OpenAI in 2023, which you just mentioned. And so I think he's earned this reputation, obviously, as not only this person is responsible for a lot of the technical innovation, but he also, I think, because a lot of his work is oriented around safety, that he also is seen as like somebody on the frontier who's a little like worried about the technology and its implications. And anyway, a lot of people gravitate to him. And so I think in that sense, he's the perfect person to write a book about, not just the research, but it's his reading list, which I also think reflects in some degree his mental model, which people are just interested in. What does Ilya see? Which is actually a kind of a meme that circulated after the whole Sam Altman thing. I think it was Elon Musk who tweeted out, "What did Ilya see?" And people just like are generally interested in like that. What does Ilya see? What did he see that made him want to fire Sam Altman?
Yeah.
And what is his mental model? And I think to some degree, the reading list reflects his mental model. It gives you some insight into like, what is his worldview?
What is, and feel free to say no, I can cut it out if you're aspiring to work at OpenAI, but what's your take on all of that, the entire saga? The closed AI?
Yeah, no aspirations of working at OpenAI. Yeah, I think it's hard to pin down to one thing exactly. And it's hard to just even look at the OpenAI board firing in isolation. I think it probably deserves more context. And so, are you familiar with GPT-2? Beyond the model itself, GPT-2 in 2019, when it was released, it was deemed too dangerous to release by OpenAI. Are you familiar with that saga?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that is probably an indication that it's at least an indication of like how seriously Ilya takes this, the AI safety question. And it probably signals to some degree the board saga a little bit, which wouldn't happen for 4 years. But OpenAI's position in 2019 was to act early rather than late, which if you look at a lot of the AI safety literature, that's effectively the default position. It's much better to act too early or prematurely than it is to act too late. And that's, I think, what you saw with GPT-2. They ultimately determined that it was too dangerous to release, and they ended up staggering the release of the model. So instead of releasing the full size model, they released a small version of it. I forget the timing exactly. It was probably the summer of 2019. A few months later, they released a slightly larger model. And over the course of about 9 months, they released sort of these stages, increasingly larger models, until ultimately, I think it was maybe the spring of 2020, where they released the full model, which was only a couple of months before GPT-3 was released.
So do you personally buy into that? Because I think a lot of people I spoke to see that as like just hype building. So, oh, too dangerous to release, and then they go and release it anyway a few months later.
Yeah. No, for sure. Yeah. I think that was the reaction. A lot of people were skeptical of OpenAI's position at the time because it was the first time. And despite AI, the field of AI being obsessed with these fast takeoff scenarios and intelligence explosions, and even in the media, you see a lot of like fear mongering around AI, the Terminator scenario where it's going to be like the killer robot becoming
Skynet, yeah.
Skynet. Yeah, exactly. Skynet becoming sentient or self-aware and retaliating preemptively against humans.
Yeah, that's why everybody says please in their prompts, pretty please in their prompt.
Yeah.
It's
There's almost like a Pascal wager kind of like reasoning to it. Is you might as well be nice to it because what's it really going to cost you? And I think you're right to be skeptical. I think that kind of discourse, anytime you're talking about kind of like existential risk that is extremely low probabilities, you always have like that kind of discourse, I think, is always vulnerable to that like Pascal style reasoning. And researchers, I think, had reason. They were justified to be skeptical because I remember distinctly in 2019, the position was like, hey, if you really are worried about safety or security around these tools, the best thing you could do is release it to the research community because it would give everybody a chance to evaluate it instead of being behind. And that's where OpenAI started to get that moniker of closed AI. And that certainly gained momentum over the last few years. I think my position is, I think those are reasonable critiques, quite honestly. And I think that was probably my position in 2019. I think it's evolved a little bit in the sense that what I like about it is not that I think it's right, but what I like about it is it's like this living doubt. It's something real and material, and it was all shared in a very transparent way with the public. Whereas there are a lot of people that have this skepticism of AI, either from like the doomer community, which is like our existential risk is high, or the P-doom is high. They're not doing anything about it. And then there's also the skeptics on the other side who are like, these models are they're just databases, or they're just next token predictors. And so they're both skeptical positions. One's more about the existential risks. One's more just about the performance of the models, or maybe as it relates to the hype. They're just words. Whereas what I like about Ilya is that his doubt and even his hopes about the technology is living. They're not paper doubts. Like, he doesn't talk about AI. He doesn't talk about the risk of AI. He does stuff about it. Where I think he made a mistake between GPT-2 and the Sam Altman board fiasco is that his caution with GPT-2 was staged and it was staggered and it was reversible ultimately. Like you could always say, oh, we were wrong about all of this, which they ended up saying actually in 2020, like all the risks that we were worried about never materialized. Here's the model. Whereas in 2023 with the Altman scenario, that was explosive and it was impossible to unwind once it was initiated. So to me, I think that's the lesson from a safety perspective. It's like whatever your decision is, your living doubt is, it needs to be stated clearly to the public. This is our reasoning behind it, but it needs to be structured in a way where you could always reverse it and you could say, oh yeah, like nothing's here. And here you go, here's the model or whatever.
In your mind, is OpenAI still at the frontier of LLMs, or is it now at the frontier of raising money?
Yeah, they may go hand in hand, maybe to stay at the frontier. I don't have a lot of visibility into OpenAI and their operations. They seem to be pretty earnest that they're constantly running out of compute. They have two masters. One is this research agenda and constantly training new models. And then the other one is production orientation. And so they're constantly borrowing over the future to satisfy existing constraints and vice versa. I think they're trying to stay competitive with Google and maybe even XAI, who seems to be a contender. Claude, I think, is also in that conversation.
Yeah. Hearing a lot about Claude lately.
Oh yeah, cursors. Yeah, it's interesting. They've gone in different directions. OpenAI is more interested in these scientific pursuits, solving mathematical proofs, whereas Anthropic seems to be focused largely in the software development domain. And so it will be interesting. Everyone talks about all these companies being the same, but I think there are subtle differences between each of them. And maybe those subtle differences will ultimately determine who wins, or maybe they just all find like some subset of the market to compete in.
What's your view on things like DeepSeek?
I haven't followed DeepSeek much. The idea of model distillation, I think, is pretty interesting. It goes all the way back to probably Jürgen Schmidhuber's work in the 90s. And I think, obviously, their work was disruptive to a large degree. But it also probably doesn't exist without an OpenAI or an Anthropic because it is a distilled model from those models. So I think all of the models are going to have to get a lot cheaper. Otherwise, they're going to have to increase the prices to consumers. And it's not obvious people will pay ultimately like $200 a month for these models.
The economics are funny at the moment, right? I think like with all of the subscriptions, they're priced quite low. And then if you start using like their APIs and you pay per actual tokens, you realize that, oh, wow, they're actually giving me quite a good deal with the subscription for personal use. But then when it's a company trying to use that, all of a sudden it's a different conversation because it has to make money somehow.
They're making a lot of money. They're just not making a big
They're
profit.
just not turning a profit.
It's just that tiny detail of being profitable.
I'm completely scared of what happens with all these data centers being built now and all of these GPUs, all these billions of dollars go in, they go out of our life. And like when people realize, okay, fine, so we pump this many billions on top of, I don't know, the latest GPT-5 and like we don't really see any difference. Do you think the bubble, complete panic on the market is due anytime soon? Not financial advice.
Yeah. There's almost no financial advice to give at this point. These are all private companies and nobody's like getting in on a seed round anymore. These are institutional investors putting in billions. It's out of reach, I think, to most people. My position on the whole bubble idea is that the kind of bubble that certainly there's a bubble, it's bubbly, right? I just don't think that a bubble, it's bad, of course, because some of these companies are going to lose, but companies will always lose and there are always going to be winners. And so people are going to win some money and other people are going to lose money. I think all of that is inevitable. As it relates to bubbles, I don't think anything important happens without bubbles. There's not this alternate scenario where we're all like reasonable, rational people. I don't know how to explain it. Like smart money doesn't do well in bubbles. And I think right now there's not a lot of room for reason. Like people are just excited about the technology. but also the excitement has to be there. You don't get this kind of capital and this kind of attraction. There's not like all of this talent running to solve hard problems if there's not hype. And so to me, hype is required. It's just one of the ingredients, one of the many ingredients required for something like this, a paradigm shift. And so there's a bubble that's going to be burst, but that bubble, I think ultimately it's going to be different than the 2008 financial bubble, which was mostly speculation. There wasn't underlying things that we were doing. It was just debt, really. Whereas 2000 with the dot-com bubble, there was something there. Like we were building the internet. And so a lot of people lost in that situation. Bad ideas were removed from the market and everybody reorganized around where the value ultimately was. And I think that's what's probably going to happen with AI too.
Yeah, I like that point of view. I think the nuance is lacking in the discourse online about it. It's either, oh, this is all the best things in sliced bread and it's going to be great, or it's just going to blow up. But in reality, there is useful technology in there. It's just bubbly as well, which, like you said, I think I agree with that the hype is required.
Yeah. And so the thing I look at are usage statistics, and there are hundreds of millions of people that are using the technology, way more than the internet in 1999. Nobody was using the internet in 1999. And are these companies profitable? No. They're going to obviously have to figure out ways, and maybe that's a combination of things. Ultimately, it's going to be new data centers, cheaper energy. It's also going to require them to figure out more efficient ways to deliver the products and services to consumers. But yeah.
That's a good detour. But back to our man, Ilya. So Ilya has a list. You like the list. Manning talked you into writing a book about that. What's the best way to give people a glimpse of what that's like? I was actually planning on asking you about what's the most important ones, but you destroyed that idea early on, saying that don't go one by them. So
yeah, my target reader is probably it's not the people who's writing these papers, and why I wanted to situate them in a broader narrative, not only a human narrative, but also a temporal one, which is like, how do these ideas interact with each other and build on each other? But also like, how do they persist today? Have they been replaced by something else? To me, my target reader is probably not picking up these papers. They might be interested in these papers, but it's overwhelming. They're written by researchers for researchers. They're not written by research for a broader audience. And so that's like, my goal is to not only distill it into something a little more consumable, but adding the context hopefully makes it, one, interesting to read and hopefully finish the book. That's the kind of like human story. And Ilya, in this case, is like the narrative through line that I'm using throughout the book, but also like the context around them. What worlds did they enter? How do those ideas persist today? How do they interact with other ideas in the paper? And that hopefully that reinforces the topics, and it just makes everything a little more salient. Obviously, there are some papers on the list, which I think makes it a little more interesting. There are some papers on the list that are important, AlexNet being one of them, ResNet being another, Transformers being another. These are papers that everyone should read, and most people have heard of. There are other papers that are a little more niche, and I think those niche ones offer a little more insight into Ilya and his world model. But together, I think it tells... It's not as though the list is just like you were to reverse sort by citations and take the top 30 papers. That would be a list, but it wouldn't maybe be the most interesting list. Whereas this one adds a little more nuance.
No, I like that. It also feels like a snapshot in time, because a couple of years ago, I was trying to write a newsletter about starting with AI, and I was trying to do a weekly thing where I would pick up the most important things that happened and try to read through the papers. And after about 6 months, and where all my hair turned white or gray, I stopped, because it was just impossible task. And I know a lot of people use some LLMs to pick up the highlights and build teams around that. But like for an average person who actually has a life, and this is not like their full-time job, it's just a lot. So having a snapshot in time here of this mythical list feels like a nice idea too. Are you worried about that becoming out of date soon?
Yeah, great question. A little context on the list itself, because I don't think I mentioned it earlier. So the list is shared by Ilya with John Carmack, and John Carmack is a famous software developer responsible for Commander Keen and Doom and Wolfenstein, a bunch of really prominent games in the 80s. And he was leaving his job at Meta, where he was, I think, CTO of Oculus. And so he was working in the virtual reality space, and he wanted to get into AI. He was being recruited actually at the time by OpenAI and met Ilya, and that's when he said, I'm really interested in this AI stuff at the time. I think this is pre-chat GPT, so maybe it was 2021, 2022. And so that's the list. That's where it came from. But what's interesting about that interaction is it came with the promise of, according to Carmack, Ilya promised that if you read this list, you'll understand 90% of what's going on in artificial intelligence. And one, I think that is what makes a book like this really attractive, is because, as you've underscored, there are a lot of research papers coming out every week, none of which are easy or accessible to the lay person. It's just too much. Nobody has that kind of bandwidth. Even if you used AI to distill each paper, you would never get through that list. But, what I think it also implicitly underscores is that not all papers are important. They're always going to be a canon, if you will, of like important papers that will follow this Pareto principle, where it will explain 80 or 90% of what's really going on, quote unquote. And I think the list does a pretty good job at that. I think if you do read the papers, or if you buy the book, you'll understand a lot of what's going on in AI, and you'll be in a stronger position to evaluate those papers. Now, 90%, there's probably, does that decay over time? I'm sure it does to some degree. I don't think it's going to like meaningfully decline until you see maybe a new paradigm shift. And maybe that's moving away from transformers, or maybe that's moving away from deep learning altogether. But I think that's unlikely in the short term. And I think a book like this I think it will have this nice Pareto quality to it for a couple of years.
What's your view on the limits of the current best architectures, right? We've been looking at the LLMs for a number of years now, and every release was decreasingly exciting. Do you think we're close to reaching what's basically possible with that without any massive changes to the architectures? Diminishing returns, or can it continue scaling up and getting better, but just throwing more money at it?
Yeah, I don't have answers, honestly. As it relates to scaling, I think scaling laws are empirical laws of diminishing returns. And a lot of people have recently celebrated like GPT-5 not being as impressive as like the difference between different previous models, like 2 to 3 and 3 to 4, and now 4 to 5. Like each one of those seems less impressive than the previous iteration. A lot of that, I think, is you're just hitting asymptotics. Like at some point, like you're going to have these smaller gains, right? Like the difference between 2 and 3 was visible in every aspect, but that's also a reflection of how 2 was. And you could go through the list. 5 is, to me, visibly better, but not as significant as 3 to 4. And that may just be a result of 4 just being a really impressive model. The diminishing return part is real. It's always been real. Since scaling laws were first explained, I think it was in the Kaplan paper, or Kaplan in 2020, Jared Kaplan at OpenAI talked about the scaling laws of GPT-3. And it was explicitly stated in there that look at these, like it had negative exponents, like there were diminishing returns. And, what I think is amazing and easily lost in the whole like diminishing returns conversation is not that there are diminishing returns. It's that scaling has been powerful. It's perhaps the first time in the history of artificial intelligence where there's been like this free lunch. Like all you had to do was make the models bigger and throw more data at them, and they improved in performance, sometimes in very unexpected ways. And that changed everything. For 50, 60 years, it required novelty. You had to come out with a new model or a new training trick or some kind of like innovation. And those things are very expensive to create. And all we've done in the last 5 years is just go bigger, which I think has been remarkable, and we shouldn't overlook that. However, there are diminishing returns, and at some point, the gains are just not going to be worth the investment to make these models larger, even with cheaper energy. And so it will be interesting. I think Ilya actually in a recent interview said something to the effect of the era of scaling is over, and now we're going to need to come up with some good ideas to move the frontier forward.
Love it. Yeah, I love how you summarized that. There was a period of free lunch for a minute. I guess it helped when you're trying to raise amounts of money that are GDP of medium-sized countries. So definitely that. Okay, so while we're at wild predictions, 2 more questions to you. What do you think is something that's not hyped enough that people are sleeping on? And what do you think are empty promises that are flying around that we're definitely not hitting?
Yeah, good questions. I'll probably answer the second part of the question first. I think the whole idea of AGI it's not something that I find very appealing. And I think it's because it's like a paper hope. It's something that people have talked about for the last 20 years. It's not necessarily a recent thing, though it certainly gained momentum over the last couple of years. But this idea that it would be like humans, I just don't think there's a lot of evidence to support that this substrate is going to produce human-like intelligence, nor do I think it's necessary. I don't think we need machines to act like humans with all of the benefit, presumably all of the limitations as well. I think what we have is really powerful technology. I think it will slowly get better. There's no exponential or S-curve anymore. I think the scaling laws are reaching like this asymptotic. You're going to see linear progression, but I think that linear progression is going to be consistent with stable investment, and the models are just going to get better. They're never going to be human-like intelligence. And so I think the implication of that statement is that like these safety concerns that some researchers have about the alignment of AI and the safety of AI, I think become less important. And so I would probably also say that relatedly, like my position on AGI also spills over into the AI research domain, which I just don't think is as important. I don't see an existential risk from my computer.
And the other one is what's not hyped enough.
I don't know. I think there's a lot of undue skepticism about the technology, just as a lot of people round up to these machines are partially conscious, which is something Ilya has said in the past, or AGI is on the horizon, maybe it's 1 or 2 years. Like all of that is like rounding up and it's unjustified. But I think a lot of people, a lot of skeptics today are needlessly rounding down, and they call the models stochastic parrots or next token predictors, or they're just databases. And I think for those people, they don't understand the technology, and it's none of those things. And so at least for that subset, I think they're just generally underestimating all of the technology and where it's going to go. It's going to be pervasive in probably 5 years, 10 years at the most.
Right. Just the economics need to start lining up. Fair enough. Okay. So your book, imminent on Manning Area Access Program. One day I will learn what it means. That means you can actually go and read it online. When is it coming out in print?
The tentative date is May, which we're on target. The book is done. It's just entered the second peer review phase. The last 5 chapters are going to be on MEEP, which is just what that means is that it's an early draft. It hasn't gone through peer review yet. It hasn't gone through copy editing yet, but it gives readers who might be excited about the book a chance to get early access to it. So I guess my point is there's nothing on the horizon that should prevent it from releasing in May, as it's already done.
And for everybody who wants to follow your adventures, what's the best way? LinkedIn?
Yeah, probably LinkedIn. I'm most active there. I have an X account, but yeah, I don't have the capacity to really do both. So LinkedIn is usually where I am.
Awesome. Rich, it's been amazing to talk to you. Thank you for finding the time for this, and the best luck with the book sales.
Thank you.
Cheers.